Marcus had been back 3 weeks when he first noticed the old man. Every morning, same bench under the oak tree in the village cemetery, same dark coat, same stillness. The man never spoke to anyone, never brought flowers, just sat. Marcus walked past him every day on his way to his mother's house. He didn't stop. He had his own dead to think about. Then, one morning, the old man's coat was open in the heat. Marcus was close enough to see the scar. It ran from the right shoulder diagonally across the chest to the left side. Old and white and long. The kind of scar that only came from one thing. Not an accident. Not surgery. A blade pulled deep and fast. The kind of wound that should have killed the man who received it. Marcus stopped walking. He had seen scars like that exactly once before. In a photograph. In a military history book his grandfather had given him at 16. A photograph of a veteran of a war that ended 50 years before Marcus was born. He said, "Where did you get that?" The old man looked up at him. Grey-green eyes, very clear, the specific clarity of someone who has been looking at the same piece of ground for a very long time. He said, "The same place you got yours." Marcus had a scar of his own, on his left forearm, not visible, covered by the sleeve of his jacket. He had not shown it to anyone since coming home. He sat down on the bench. He said, "That war ended 50 years ago." The old man said, "Some wars don't end when they're supposed to." Before Marcus left the cemetery that morning, he would know something about the old man that changed everything he thought he understood about the conflict he had just come home from, and about the conflict the old man had never come home from, and about the specific thing that connected two soldiers from two different wars on the same bench in a village cemetery in the early morning. Who was the old man? And what had he been waiting in that cemetery to tell someone? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe that some soldiers carry their wars long after the wars are supposed to be over, subscribe. Because what the old man told Marcus that morning was something that nobody had asked to hear for 50 years. The village of Kreisau was small in the way of European villages that had been small for several centuries and had no particular reason to change. 400 residents, a church, a school that served 3 nearby villages, 2 shops, a cafe that was also the post office on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The cemetery was at the eastern edge of the village beside the church, a walled rectangle of perhaps 200 graves spanning the better part of 3 centuries of the village's dead. Marcus Veld had grown up in Kreisau. He had left at 18, gone to the city for university, joined the army at 22 in the specific way of people who are looking for a shape for themselves and find the military offers one. He had served 6 years. He had been in 2 deployments. He had come home 3 weeks ago and was sleeping in his childhood bedroom and eating his mother's cooking and trying to understand what it was like to be in a place that had not changed at all while he had changed entirely. He was 28 years old. He was not, by the clinical criteria he was aware of, experiencing anything that required professional intervention. He was sleeping adequately, not well, but adequately, which was the distinction that the medical officer at the out-processing facility had made when Marcus had sat across from him for the mandatory discharge evaluation. He was not drinking beyond the normal social amounts. He was not having nightmares in the dramatic cinematic sense. He was having the specific low-level disruption of sleep that came from a nervous system that had been calibrated to a high-alert environment for 6 years and was now being asked to recalibrate to a village of 400 people where the most significant sound at night was the church bell marking the hours. He was fine. He was just present in a different way than he had been present before, more aware of space, more attentive to people's hands, more likely to notice where the exits were in any room he entered, more aware of the specific weight of silences, the difference between a silence that meant nothing and a silence that meant something was about to change. He had told the medical officer that he was fine. The medical officer had noted his answers and given him a pamphlet about transition services and told him to contact the Veterans Support Line if he found the adjustment difficult. Marcus had taken the pamphlet and had not called the line. He did not know what he would say if he called it. What he was experiencing did not have a name that fit the forms on the pamphlet. He walked every morning because walking was something he could do without explaining to anyone. His mother understood, in the unspoken way that mothers sometimes understood things, that he needed to move and that the moving was better performed alone. She did not follow him or ask detailed questions about where he went. She left food in the refrigerator and said good morning when he came back and did not require him to be what he had been before he left. His mother said he was quiet. His childhood friends, the few who were still in Kreisau, said he seemed tired. He accepted both assessments without elaborating. He walked every morning, not for exercise. The walks had no particular destination or route, though they tended toward the eastern part of the village because the eastern part of the village was quieter and the fields beyond it were open, and the open fields were easier than the narrow streets of the center where people might speak to him. The cemetery was on the way to the fields. He passed it every morning. The old man had been there every morning since Marcus returned. He was sure of this because the bench under the oak tree was visible from the cemetery gate, and he had registered the man's presence each morning without stopping. A figure on a bench, a dark coat, the stillness that Marcus recognized as the stillness of someone with no particular reason to move. He had not stopped because it was not his business. The cemetery was a public space in the limited sense of a space where the public had rights of access and no particular obligations to each other. The old man was entitled to sit on the bench. Marcus was entitled to walk past. He had walked past 11 times before the morning the coat was open. The scar was impossible to miss once the coat was open. It crossed the old man's torso in the specific path of something that had been inflicted with force and speed, starting at the right shoulder, going diagonally across the chest and abdomen, ending at the left side just above the hip. The kind of path a blade made when used by someone who knew how to use one and was using it with the intention of ending the person in front of them. The scar was old. It had the specific color and texture of a wound that had healed over many decades, pale, slightly raised, the skin around it different in quality from the ordinary skin of the old man's torso. Not a recent injury, not a surgical scar. Something that had been made in a specific moment of violence and had been carried on this body ever since. Marcus had stopped walking. He had seen this type of scar in a photograph. A black and white photograph in a military history book that his grandfather, who had been a military historian before his retirement, had given him at 16. The photograph showed a veteran of a specific conflict, one of the late 20th century conflicts in the region that had produced particular forms of close-quarters violence, and the veteran had a scar of this specific diagonal type. His grandfather had explained it. This was the characteristic wound of a particular kind of engagement. Not a wound from gunfire, not a wound from shrapnel, a wound from direct physical confrontation, the kind that happened when the fighting was at distances that made firearms irrelevant. The conflict that produced this type of wound had ended 50 years ago. The man on the bench was perhaps 79 years old. Marcus sat down. He said, "Where did you get that?" The old man looked up. The grey-green eyes were clear in a way that old eyes were not always clear, the specific clarity of someone who had been looking at things carefully for a very long time and had not lost the habit. He said, "The same place you got yours." Marcus had a scar of his own. On his left forearm, running across the outside of the arm from just below the elbow to approximately the wrist. It was not as dramatic as the scar on the old man's torso. It was thinner, shorter, the wound that had made it less severe. But it was the same type of wound, made in the same way. He had not shown it to anyone since coming home. He wore long sleeves. He had given no explanation to his mother or his friends, and they had not asked. He pulled up his left sleeve. The old man looked at the scar on Marcus's arm. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down." Marcus was already sitting, but he understood what the old man meant, not the physical act of sitting, but something prior to it, the settling in, the decision to be present for what was coming. He settled in. The old man said, "My name is Emil Voss. I was born in this village in 1945. I served in the conflict of the 1970s. I received this scar in the engagement at Browers Pass in 1974. I have been sitting on this bench for 11 years. He said it in the manner of someone giving a briefing, clearly, sequentially, without emotional elaboration. The manner of someone who had organized information carefully over a long time and was now delivering it in the form in which it had been organized. Marcus said, 11 years. Emil said, "Yes, since my wife died. She is buried here. I come every morning." He said, "But that is not the only reason I come." Marcus waited. Emil said, "I come because I have been waiting for someone to sit down." The engagement at Browers Pass in 1974 had been, in the official military history of the conflict it belonged to, a minor action, a paragraph, perhaps two, in the comprehensive histories, a footnote in the specialized studies of the specific campaign it was part of. Not a significant engagement in the strategic sense. No ground was permanently held. No objective of strategic importance was achieved or denied. In the history that was taught in schools and summarized in encyclopedias, Browers Pass existed as a name in a list. In Emil Voss's body, it existed as a diagonal line of white scar tissue that ran from his right shoulder to his left hip. He told Marcus about it the way he had organized it over 50 years of sitting with it. Not chronologically, not in the order that a historian would arrange the facts, but in the order of what needed to be understood before the next thing could be understood. He had been 29 years old. He had been a sergeant. He had been leading a patrol of 7 men through the pass on a reconnaissance mission. Not a combat mission, a reconnaissance. The difference being that a reconnaissance patrol was supposed to observe and report rather than engage. They had not been able to observe and report without engaging. What had happened in Browers Pass was not unusual in the context of the conflict. Ambushes of reconnaissance patrols were common. The terrain favored them. The enemy understood this terrain better than any external force could understand it. What was unusual was what Emil had done in the 30 seconds after the first contact. He did not describe this immediately. He described the patrol, the men, the terrain, the weather that morning. A clear, cold morning in October, the kind of morning that made the pass feel like a different world from the valley below it. He described the specific quality of the silence in the pass before the ambush, the particular silence that experienced soldiers learned to read as different from ordinary silence. He had read it. He had not been fast enough. 4 of his 7 men had gone down in the first exchange. Not dead. He did not know that yet. In the moment. Down. The remaining 3 were behind cover. Emil was in the open, between the cover his men had found and the position from which the fire was coming. He had done something that the official incident report described as demonstrating exceptional courage under fire. What he described to Marcus was simpler. He had done the only thing available to him in the specific geometry of the situation. The geometry required someone to move toward the fire rather than away from it, and he was the one in the position to move, and so he had moved. He had reached the position. He had disabled it. In the process of disabling it, he had received the wound. He had not noticed the wound until the engagement was over, which was the specific quality of certain severe wounds in combat. The body's management of its own crisis kept the awareness of damage at a level below immediate consciousness. All 3 of the men behind cover survived. 2 of the 4 who had gone down in the first exchange survived. 2 did not. The official report noted the outcome, the casualties, the action taken. It noted Emil's conduct in language that was precise and controlled and did not fully contain what had happened. He had been given a commendation. He had come home. He had carried the scar and the commendation and the names of the two men who had not survived. He had married a woman named Hannah, who was from a neighboring village, and who had the specific quality of someone who understood that a person could contain things that were never fully spoken, and who did not require the speaking as a condition of the marriage. He had worked as a joiner for 30 years, the work of someone who understood wood and time and the specific satisfaction of making things that lasted. He had raised 2 children who were now in their 50s and who lived in cities and visited in the summers and who knew their father as a quiet man who sat in the cemetery in the mornings. He had not spoken about the past to anyone except his wife, and to her only once, in the specific way that some things are told once and then kept. He had carried the names of Heinrich Wulff and Karl Brandt in the specific interior location where soldiers carried the names of the dead under their command, not consciously, not all the time, but available, present in the way of things that have been absorbed into the structure of a person, rather than stored as memories that could be accessed or set aside. They were simply part of him, as the scar was part of him. He had sat on the bench every morning for 11 years, because Hannah was buried here, and because the bench was under the oak tree, and because the oak tree had been here before any of the other things in the cemetery, and would be here after all of them, and there was something in that permanence that was useful to sit near. He had not, in 11 years, expected anything from the sitting. He had not been waiting, in any conscious sense, for someone to sit down. He had simply been sitting, saying the names into the air above the cemetery, maintaining the record in the only form available to him. He said, "My wife asked me once near the end. She said, 'Is there something you still need to say about it?' I told her there was. She said, 'You should say it before I go. I didn't say it in time.'" He looked at the grave marker that was visible from the bench, 3rd row from the back, a simple stone with her name and dates. He said, "I have been saying it to this bench ever since." Marcus sat with this for a moment. He said, "What is it? What do you still need to say?" Emil was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That the 2 men who died should not have died. Not because their deaths were anyone's fault. They were not. The ambush was well executed. The first exchange was too fast for any response to prevent what happened. Their deaths were the result of the geometry of the situation and not of any failure." He said, "But I was the sergeant. I was responsible for the patrol. I brought those 7 men into that pass, and 2 of them did not come out. And the commendation they gave me for what I did afterward, I have never been able to accept it as anything other than a document that existed in the place where an acknowledgement of those 2 deaths should have existed." He said, "The commendation said I acted with exceptional courage. What it should have said, alongside that, was, 2 men died under his command in Brauers Pass. Their names were Heinrich Wulff and Karl Brandt. They were 23 and 26 years old. They had families. The commendation said none of this." He said, "I have been saying it to this bench for 11 years. Heinrich Wulff and Karl Brandt died in Brauers Pass in October 1974. They were 23 and 26 years old." He looked at Marcus. He said, "That is what I needed to say, to someone who would understand why it needed to be said." Marcus understood. He did not say this immediately. He sat with the understanding for a moment, the way you sit with the specific quality of recognition that comes from encountering something that matches something you have been carrying. He had his own names. Not 2, 3. From the second deployment, from a specific engagement that the after-action report had described in the same controlled, precise language that military after-action reports used for all engagements. The report had noted the casualties. It had noted Marcus's conduct. It had not noted what Marcus had been saying in various forms since coming home. He pulled up his left sleeve again. He looked at the scar on his forearm. He said, "Thomas Reiter, Lars Hoffmann, Anne Bergman." He said the names the way Emil had said his names, clearly, in sequence, with the specific quality of someone speaking a truth that has been held too long in silence. Emil looked at him, the grey-green eyes. He said, "Tell me about them," Marcus told him, not the after-action report version, the version he had been carrying, what they were like, what Tomasz said in the specific way he had of saying things that made everyone around him laugh even in difficult circumstances. What Lars did with the cards they played in the evenings, the specific habit of arranging and rearranging his hand that everyone teased him about. What Anne had written in the last letter home, which Marcus had not read, but which her mother had told him about, the letter that arrived the day after Anne did not. He told it the way Emil had told his, not in the order of a report, but in the order of what needed to be understood. Emil listened to all of it. When Marcus finished, Emil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Those names are in the air now. They were in you before. Now they're in the air between us." He said, "That is the difference." Marcus sat with this. The morning light was on the cemetery, the specific autumn light of October in a European village, low and warm and making the old stone markers cast long shadows across the grass. The oak tree above them moved slightly in a small wind. He said, "Is that why you come here? To put the names in the air?" Emil said, "I come because my wife is here, and because the bench is here, and because this is the place where I have found, over 11 years, that the names are easier to say." He said, "A cemetery is a place where the dead have already been acknowledged. That acknowledgement makes it easier to say the other names, the ones that needed acknowledging and weren't." Marcus looked at the grave markers around them, at the names and dates on the stones, at the simple formal language of death recorded and placed in a permanent location. He said, "How long did it take before it was easier?" Emil said, "Several years before it was bearable, several more before it was easier. Easier is not the same as resolved. It never resolves, but it becomes possible to carry it in a different way." He said, "You carry it differently when someone else knows you're carrying it." He said, "That is why I have been waiting for someone to sit down." Marcus came back the following morning. He had not planned to. He had gone home from the cemetery and eaten breakfast with his mother and spent the afternoon doing the ordinary things of being home. The small repairs that accumulated in a house over 6 years of someone's absence. The conversations with neighbors that were brief and polite and contained nothing of substance. He had gone to bed and slept in the specific way he had been sleeping since coming home, adequately but not deeply. In the morning, he walked to the cemetery. Emil was on the bench. Marcus sat down. They did not speak for a while. The morning was cold and clear, the October light flat and honest on the gravestones. Emil said, "You came back." Marcus said, "Yes." Emil said, "Good." That was all. For some time, they sat in the silence that was not the silence before something but the silence of two people who had said what needed saying and were now in the specific quiet that followed. After a while, Emil said, "Tell me about the deployment, not the engagement, before that, what it was like." Marcus told him, not with any specific purpose, simply because Emil had asked and because Marcus had not, since coming home, been asked to describe the deployment in a way that was genuine rather than social. His mother asked how he was. His friends asked if it was bad. Nobody had asked what it was like. He described the specific quality of the environment, the particular way that time worked in a deployment, the expansion and contraction of days, the way certain periods felt compressed to nothing and certain moments felt enormous and permanent. The sounds, the specific vocabulary that developed between people who shared an experience, the shorthand that became the language of a unit and that was not translatable to people who weren't in it. He described Tomasz and Lars and Anne not as casualties, but as people, the specific living quality of them, the way they existed in the daily life of the unit. He described the morning of the engagement, not the engagement itself, but the morning that preceded it, the ordinary quality of it, the way it was indistinguishable from the preceding mornings until it wasn't. Emil listened to all of it. He asked specific questions, not about tactics or strategy, about the people. What was Lars good at beyond the cards? What did Tomáš find funny? What was Anne's particular quality of competence, the specific thing she did that made the people around her feel safer? These were questions that nobody had asked Marcus. He answered them. When he finished, it was mid-morning. The village was moving around them, people going about their Tuesday. The church clock had rung twice. Emil said, "Thank you." Marcus said, "For what?" Emil said, "For telling me about them. They are strangers to me, and I'm glad to know something about them." He said, "The people who die in these engagements, they do not stop being people. They were people before the engagement, and they are people afterward. The fact of their death does not reduce them to a function in a report." He said, "Telling me who they were is a way of insisting on that." Marcus sat with this. He thought about the after-action report, about the controlled, precise language, about the names in the casualty section and the brief notations of rank and age beside each name. He said, "The reports don't say who they were." Emil said, "No. Reports record what happened. They do not record who the people were who were in what happened. That is a different kind of record." He said, "The different kind of record has to be kept by the people who knew them." Marcus said, "I don't know how to keep it." Emil said, "You're keeping it now. You kept it this morning when you described them to me. The keeping is the telling." He said, "You tell someone who didn't know them. You tell them what the person was like. You put that into the air between two people who are present for the telling. That's the record." He said, "I told my wife once near the end. I should have told her earlier. I should have told her many times, in many forms. Each telling is its own keeping." He said, "Come tomorrow. Tell me something else about them." Marcus came back the following morning. He sat on the bench under the oak tree and told Emil something about Tomáš and something about Lars and something about Anne, things he had not told anyone. Things that had been inside him for 3 weeks of walking past a cemetery and eating breakfast with his mother and sleeping inadequately in a childhood bedroom. Emil listened. He asked questions. He received the telling with the specific quality of someone who understood what the telling cost and what it produced. They met every morning for 6 weeks, not always with intention. Marcus did not always know, when he woke, that he was going to walk to the cemetery. But his feet went that way in the specific manner of a body that knows what it needs before the mind has organized the need into a conscious decision. He would eat breakfast with his mother, exchange the brief morning words, and then he would be walking east, and then he would be at the cemetery gate, and then he would be on the bench. Emil was always there. He arrived apparently before Marcus, regardless of what time Marcus came. Marcus tried arriving earlier one morning, 6:30, before full light, and Emil was already there. He did not ask how early Emil came. He understood that for someone who had been doing this for 11 years, the time was simply the time. In those 6 weeks, Marcus learned the full shape of Brouwer's Pass, not the incident report shape, the full shape, assembled from many mornings of Emil adding detail in the way that genuine memory added detail over time, not all at once but in pieces, the way sediment settled. The morning light on the pass before the engagement, the sound of the specific bird that had been calling in the trees above them, a sound Emil had associated with that morning for 50 years, and that he had once described to Hannah as the sound he heard in his sleep sometimes when the pass was present in him. Emil described each of his 7 men, not their military functions, who they were, the specific quality of each person, the things that made them themselves. He described Heinrich Wolff as someone who had a way of making situations feel less serious than they were, not by denying the seriousness, but by finding the specifically absurd element in every serious situation and naming it quietly, usually too quietly for anyone but the people immediately around him to hear. He described Karl Brandt as the most methodical person he had ever worked with, the man who checked everything twice and knew where everything was, and who had kept Emil's patrol functional through the organizational chaos of the early weeks of the campaign in ways that Emil had not fully appreciated until Karl was no longer there to do it. He described the 5 who survived with the same specificity, where they were now, the ones he had been able to track, what their lives had looked like after the engagement, the ones he had lost contact with over the decades. Marcus also told Emil about the deployment in more detail than he had told anyone, and each telling produced something different from the one before. Not more information, but a different quality of the information. The way that a memory changes shape as it is told, and the telling reveals aspects of the shape that the silence had obscured. In the 5th week, Marcus asked Emil about the commendation. He had been thinking about it since the first morning, about what Emil had said, that he had never been able to accept the commendation as anything other than a document in the place where an acknowledgement of the 2 deaths should have been. He said, "The commendation. What did you do with it?" Emil said, "It's in a box, in the house. I have not looked at it in 30 years. Marcus said, "You don't want it displayed." Emil said, "I don't want it where I would see it regularly. It would require me to explain to myself each time why I felt the way I felt about it. That explanation is not useful to perform daily." He said, "The commendation is not wrong. What I did in the past deserved recognition. But recognition of what I did not have to come at the expense of acknowledgement of what was lost." He said, "Both things could have existed in the same document. They did not." Marcus said, "My unit commander wrote the same kind of report. What I did, not what was lost." Emil said, "Yes, they write these reports the same way they have always been written. The conduct is noted, the deaths are noted. They are not put in relation to each other in a way that says, this conduct happened in the context of these deaths, and the deaths matter as much as the conduct." He said, "Because if they wrote it that way, every report would be a document of grief, and institutions do not maintain themselves by producing documents of grief." He said, "The documents of grief are kept by the people who carry the names." Marcus said, "You've been keeping yours for 50 years. Emil said, "Yes, and I will keep them until I don't need to anymore." Marcus said, "When will that be?" Emil was quiet for a long time. He said, "When the keeping feels like something that has been received rather than something that is still waiting to be received." He looked at the grave marker of his wife. He said, "She received it once. One morning, near the end, I told her the full account. Everything I am telling you, in the order I have been telling you, but in one morning. She listened to all of it. She said, 'I understand why you have been carrying this, and I understand why it was heavy.'" He said, "That was enough. 50 years of carrying and one morning of being received, and it was enough." He said, "She died 3 weeks later." He said, "I have been carrying it again since then, but the carrying is different now, because someone received it." Marcus sat with this, with the specific weight of what Emil was saying, with the idea that the keeping of a record was not the same as the record being received, that carrying was different from being heard, that one morning of genuine reception could change the weight of 50 years. He thought about the 3 weeks since coming home, about walking past the cemetery, about the names he had been carrying and the specific quality of the carrying, the weight of something that had not been received, that was still inside him without anyone knowing it was there. He thought about Emil sitting on the bench every morning. 11 years of mornings, saying the names into the air above a cemetery, waiting for someone to sit down. He said, "You've received mine." Emil said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Thomas Reiter, Lars Hoffmann, Anna Bergman. Someone knows those names now." Emil said, "Yes, I know them." Marcus said, "Is that enough?" Emil said, "It's a beginning. Tell more people. Tell them who those three were. The keeping gets lighter with each telling." He said, "And someday, I don't know when, I can't tell you when, the carrying will feel like something that has been received rather than something waiting. And when it feels that way, you will know." Marcus went home that afternoon and called his unit commander. He had not been in contact with anyone from the unit since coming home. He had not known how to begin. The way back into those conversations felt like the way back into the deployment, heavy, difficult to enter. He called. His unit commander, a woman named Captain Schiller, answered on the second ring. She said his name with the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for a call without knowing they were waiting. He said, "I need to tell you something about Thomas and Lars and Anne." She said, "Tell me." He told her. Not the after-action report version, the other version. What they were like, what made them specifically themselves. The things he had told Emil over 6 weeks of mornings, now told in a single conversation to someone who had known them and was receiving the telling in the specific way that someone receives a description of people they had lost. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. She said, "I've been waiting for someone to say their names to me." He said, "I know. I needed to learn how to say them first." She said, "How did you learn?" He said, "An old man on a bench in a cemetery." She said, "Will you tell me about him?" He told her about Emil, about Brauer's Pass and Heinrich Wolf and Karl Brandt and 50 years of carrying, about the diagonal scar and the bench and 11 years of mornings. She listened. When he finished, she said, "I want to come to Kressau." He said, "Come." She came in November, 3 days. She sat on the bench under the oak tree with Marcus and Emil, and she told her own names, the ones she had been carrying from before Marcus's deployment, from the postings that had preceded his service in her unit. She told them in the way that Marcus had learned to tell names, from Emil. Clearly, in the order of what needed to be understood, with the specific detail that made names into people. Emil listened to all of it, He asked his specific questions. He received it all. On the last day before she left, Captain Schiller said to Emil, "How do you do it? How do you listen to all of this without—" She stopped. She didn't have a word for what she was asking. Emil said, "Without what?" She said, "Without being overwhelmed by it." Emil said, "I am not a container. I am a witness. The names pass through me. I receive them. I know them. I hold them in the way that a witness holds what they have witnessed. But I am not carrying them in the way you carry the ones that are yours. I am holding them differently." He said, "A witness and a carrier are different things. A witness can hold a great deal because the holding is different from the carrying." She said, "How do you become a witness?" He said, "You sit down, you listen, you ask who they were. You receive the answer as a fact about a person, rather than as an occasion for your own feeling about it." He said, "It is a skill. It takes practice." She said, "Where did you learn it?" He said, "In this cemetery. 11 years on this bench." She said, "Alone." He said, "Until 3 weeks ago, when a young man walked past and noticed the scar." He looked at Marcus. He said, "He sat down." Everything else followed from that. Marcus stayed in Kressau through the winter. He had not planned this. He had planned to return to the city in October to begin the process of transitioning out of military service or deciding whether to re-enlist, to figure out what came next in the ordinary sequential way that people figured out what came next. But what had begun on the bench in the cemetery had its own pace, and the pace did not match the schedule he had imagined. He sat with Emil every morning. He was learning from Emil the specific quality of attention that Emil had described to Captain Schiller, the witness rather than the carrier. He was practicing it. Emil would tell him something about the pass, something small, something he had not told before, and Marcus would receive it in the way Emil had taught him, without comment that made it about Marcus's own feeling, with questions that asked about the specific reality of the thing being told. He was also telling. Captain Schiller had called 3 other people from the unit and told them that Marcus was receiving. 2 of them called him. He sat on the bench with the phone, and he listened, and he asked who they were, and he received the telling in the manner Emil had shown him. The bench became something. Not officially. It remained a wooden bench under an oak tree in a small village cemetery. But it became a specific location where something was happening that was not happening in other locations. A place where the dead could be spoken of by the people who carried them, in the presence of someone who would receive the speaking. This was, Marcus came to understand, what Emil had built in 11 years of solitary morning visits. Not simply a place to grieve, a practice of reception, a skill developed over 50 years of carrying and 11 years of daily refinement, waiting for someone who would sit down and learn it. He had sat down. He was learning it. In January, he called his own unit commander, the one from his first deployment, the one before Captain Schiller's unit. He told her about Emil and about the bench and about what he was learning. She listened carefully. She asked if she could come to Kreisau. He said yes. She came in February. She sat on the bench. She told her names. The bench received them. Emil died in April. Not suddenly. He had been ill through the winter, the specific slow illness of someone in their late 70s whose body is concluding its work. Marcus had known it was coming. Emil had spoken of it in the way he spoke of everything, clearly, without elaboration, in the order of what needed to be understood. He died at home, in the house he had lived in for 50 years, in the village where he had been born. His children came. His grandchildren came. The village came, in the way that villages come for the deaths of their long residents, not dramatically, but with the specific presence of people who understand that a person who has been in a place for a long time is part of the place, and that the place is diminished by the departure. Marcus sat with him on the second-to-last day, in the room that smelled of old wood and the specific quality of a house at the end of something. Emil was mostly sleeping. He woke once in the afternoon and looked at Marcus with the grey-green eyes. He said, "Heinrich Wolff, Karl Brandt." He said, "You know those names." Marcus said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He said, "Thomas Reiter, Lars Hoffmann, Anna Bergmann." Marcus said, "Yes." Emil closed his eyes. He said, "The names are in the air. That's the record." He slept. He died the following morning. Marcus stayed in Kreisau. He had made the decision in the way of decisions that are not made in a single moment, but accumulate over time until they are simply the shape of things. He was transitioning out of military service. This had been the plan since before the deployment, the specific duration of commitment he had agreed to, and which was concluding. The transition had paperwork and processing and the specific bureaucratic momentum of a large institution releasing a person from its structure. He completed all of it. He had found work, remote accounting work, the skill set from his university years that had seemed less relevant than military service, and that now proved to be exactly what he needed. Work that could be done from a laptop at a kitchen table in a village of 400 people, that did not require his presence anywhere specific, that paid adequately and left time for the mornings. He had a reason to be in Kreisau that was not only his mother's cooking and the familiarity of a place where he had grown up. He had the bench. He had the practice that Emil had given him and that he was continuing to develop in the months after Emil's death. The practice of sitting and receiving, of asking who they were, and hearing the answer as a fact about a person rather than as an occasion for his own feeling. People came. Not many at first. This was not a thing that had been announced or organized, and Marcus did not know how to announce or organize it, even if he had wanted to, which he did not. It was not an announcement. It was a practice. A practice could not be announced. It could only be practiced. But Captain Schiller told people. The retired officer who came in May told people. Word moved in the specific way of things that people needed but did not know they needed until they heard that someone was doing them. It moved through conversations, through the specific channels of military community where people who had been in similar situations eventually found each other. A retired officer came in May, having heard from someone who had heard from someone, and sat on the bench and told his names. He came from 200 kilometers away, and he sat on the bench for 4 hours, and he told the names of 17 men from 2 deployments over the course of a career. Marcus received them all. He asked who they were. He received the answer as Emil had taught him. The officer left looking different from when he had arrived. Not healed. That was not the right word. And Emil had told Marcus not to use it. Different. The way a person looked when something that had been inside only them was now inside them and in the air between them and someone else. A different kind of carrying. In July, a young woman came from the city, referred by someone in Captain Schiller's network. She had been home from her deployment for 4 months and was not sleeping well and had not been able to tell anyone why, which was the specific predicament that many of the people who found their way to the bench shared. There was no good way to explain what needed explaining. The forms did not contain it. The social occasions did not accommodate it. The bench was a place where the explaining was not only accommodated, but actively received. She sat on the bench. She told her names. Marcus received them. She came back the following week, and the week after that. The bench became known in the specific quiet way that things became known in small communities of people with shared experience, as a place where you could go and be received. Not famous, not organized, not a program or a service or anything that had a name. Just a bench under an oak tree in a village cemetery, occupied every morning by a 28-year-old former soldier who had learned from a 79-year-old veteran how to receive what people needed to give. Marcus had kept Emil's specific practice. Arrive early, sit still, wait. Be present when someone came to the gate. Look up. Say, "Come and sit down." Most mornings nobody came. He sat with his own names and Emil's names and the names he had received from the people who had come so far, and he held them in the way Emil had taught him, not carrying, witnessing. The distinction had taken months to understand and was still not fully understood, only practiced. His mother knew what he was doing now. He had told her in August, in the kitchen after dinner, the specific kind of conversation that happened between a parent and a child after the child has been through something the parent did not fully witness and is trying to understand. She had listened to all of it. She had asked specific questions. She had received it in the way that Emil had taught him to receive things. He had not expected her to understand. He had expected her to listen with love and without full comprehension, the way parents sometimes received the full weight of a child's experience, present but at a distance from the center of it. Instead, she had said, "This is what a priest does. This is what a priest is supposed to do, and sometimes does and often doesn't. You are doing it without the collar." He had thought about this for a long time, about what it meant to hold names, about the specific function he was serving, unasked, unorganized, on a bench in a cemetery in a village of 400 people. He had written to Emil's children, not immediately. It had taken him until September to find the words. He had written to tell them about the mornings and what their father had built in 11 years of sitting there, and what he had given Marcus in the weeks before he died. He had told them who Emil was, in the way Emil had taught him. Not the biographical facts, which they knew, but the specific quality of him, the gray-green eyes, the way of asking questions that received without directing, the specific manner of speaking that gave everything it said full weight. Emil's daughter had written back. She said, "We did not know he did this. We knew he sat there every morning. We thought it was for our mother. We did not know he was doing something." Marcus wrote, "He was doing something. He was keeping the record. He built a practice over 50 years of carrying and 11 years on the bench. I am trying to learn it." She wrote, "He would be glad." Marcus folded the letter and put it with the commendation in the box he kept for things that needed to exist somewhere without being looked at daily. He did not look at the letter often. He did not need to. He knew what it said. He sat on the bench every morning. He sat with the names. He received the people who came. In October, exactly 1 year after he had first stopped walking and noticed the scar and sat down, he walked to the cemetery in the early morning before the light was fully up. He sat on the bench. He looked at Hannah Voss's grave marker, 3rd row from the back. He said Emil's name out loud. He said Hannah's name. He said Heinrich Wolf and Karl Brandt. He said Thomas Reiter, Lars Hoffmann, Anne Bergman. He said the names of the 17 from the retired officers' 2 deployments, and the names of the young woman's names, and the names of the others who had come and sat and told. He said them all. Into the October morning air above the cemetery, in the village where Emil had been born, and where Marcus had grown up, and where the bench was under the oak tree that had been here before any of the other things, and would be here after all of them. The names were in the air. The record was kept. He sat until the light was fully up. Then he went home for breakfast. He would be back tomorrow. He would always be back.